Good morning, everyone, to everyone joining us on Zoom as well as on Facebook this morning. My name is Paul Hopper. I am one of the artistic advisors for the Lakes Area Music Festival, and I'm very happy to be here joining you to talk about Ariadne auf Naxos. I've been an artistic advisor for Lakes Area Music Festival since 2020, and I also am the Associate Artistic Administrator at the Metropolitan Opera. Before we get started, I just wanted to mention that all LAMF activities are made possible by the voters of Minnesota through grants from the Five Wings Arts Council and the Minnesota State Arts Board through a legislative appropriation from the Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. So here we are, less than a week away from the official kickoff of the Lakes Area Music Festival season with the Forbidden Love Gala on July 29th. I hope that you have enjoyed some of the prelude programs, the off-season concerts, but once the season officially kicks off, I hope you're ready for over 3 weeks of diverse programming and world-class music making in the Brainerd Lakes region. This morning, however, I'm here to introduce you to the marvelous world of Richard Strauss's Ariadne auf Naxos, which will be performed on August 12th and 14th in a fully staged production. I'm going to spend a little bit of time introducing you to the piece and to the creators, some of the music, the story, some things to listen for when you are attending one of the performances. And then I'm very happy to say that at the end of the program, I will be joined by soprano Felicia Moore. Felicia will be singing the title role of Ariadne in these performances. And she'll be joining for a little brief interview about how she's preparing for the role, and we'll get to meet her before you get to see her on stage. As you just saw in the comments section, if you have any questions that come up throughout this program, either for me or for Felicia as we get to that point in the program, feel free to drop a comment and we'll do our best to answer it, time permitting, at the end of the program. So time to jump in. As someone who works in artistic planning, which is the job that I do at the Metropolitan Opera, Ariadne auf Naxos is one of my favorite works in the repertoire because it is an opera about preparing for and performing an opera, or actually 2 operas, which I'll get to in a little bit. This piece also sits in a very dear place in my heart because I encountered the score very early in my musical training, and it was actually LAMF Artistic Director Taylor Ward that introduced it to me via one of the arias that we'll hear a little snippet of later in this program. And I remember hearing this score and really diving into learning more about it, and it really just expanded my, at that point, rather narrow understanding of what opera could sound like. To put it rather casually, my bubble was burst, and I've just been in love with this score ever since. Ariadne auf Naxos is really a proper mashup opera. You'll hear me say the word mashup quite a bit because it mixes different musical styles, different dramatic intentions, all for this really entertaining evening or afternoon at the opera. It's a mashup of mythical tales and comedy, florid singing, and big lyric dramatic singing, moments that are very grand and almost chaotic, and then moments of really beautiful intimacy and smaller scale performances. It's almost as if this opera is asking a question of the public too. Which do you prefer in your entertainment? Do you like highbrow, cerebral entertainment, or sort of lowbrow, nearly slapstick comedy? The great thing about Ariadne auf Naxos is that you get both throughout the entire score, and oftentimes both are happening at the exact same time. Richard Strauss was sort of a mashup composer as well. He did not stay within one musical style throughout his compositional output. He's a very large and diverse compositional output, from very intimate small art songs just with voice and piano, to proper symphonies, to tone poems where he's telling a narrative story without words, as well as chamber works, and then of course operas as well. Now we're here to talk about opera, so within the Within Strauss's operatic output, we see a wide variety of styles as well. In Elektra, we see sort of tragic and heroic. In Der Rosenkavalier, we see the comic and grand side of his writing. And then in an opera like Capriccio, we see very intimate, small storytelling. So how does all of this mashup lead to, how do we see that in Ariadne auf Naxos? Well, here's a brief overview of the plot of Ariadne, which is performed in 2 acts. But the first act on paper in the score is referred to as the prologue. And then the second half, or act 2, is merely called the opera. So in the prologue, we find ourselves in the house of the richest man in Vienna. We don't really know who this person is. We never get to meet him. He's one of those operatic offstage characters that we hear about, but never actually get to see. And in this home, this grand Viennese home, everyone is preparing for a really fantastic large party, a dinner party that's going to have some major entertainment pieces to it. So the plan is that after dinner, there will be a serious opera presented on the subject of Ariadne from Greek mythology. Then following that serious opera, there'll be some light entertainment by an Italian Commedia dell'arte troupe. And then finally, fireworks. You know, that sounds like a great way to spend an evening. So everybody in the prologue is preparing for either the dinner, the fireworks, the dramatic opera, or the comedic opera. And then all of a sudden, in the middle of the prologue, there's a change of plans. Due to time constraints, it's announced that the 2 performances after dinner, the Greek myth and the Italian comedy, must be performed at the same time. As someone, again, who works in artistic planning, this is sort of a worst case scenario in real life. But instead, we are in the make-believe land of opera, and instead, hilarity ensues. The second half, then the opera, are these 2 operas happening at the same time. So I want to introduce you to a little bit of the music in Ariadne auf Naxos to see how these stories are introduced from the very beginning. So the first act, or the prologue, opens with a little prelude as well. And I'll play that for you in just a moment. But I want you to listen for how these different stories are introduced and combined within the very first 2.5 minutes of the opera. This is not one of those operas that has a big 6-minute overture. It's just a brief little introduction, and then the story tumbles over. So I'll play it in just a moment, but this is what I want you to listen for. The first music that you'll hear almost sounds as if you can hear the staff of this massive house walking around, sort of pulling the blinds open for the day, letting the fresh air in, and sort of preparing for the day to start. Then you'll start hearing some swelling strings and rising tensions. That's where we're sort of introducing the mythical world of this story, the idea of art being held in a very high position in society. Then all of a sudden that gets interrupted by these sort of tumbling woodwinds. And you hear this sort of sprightly comedy. So we hear the strings with the drama, and then the woodwinds for the comedy. Then there's another introduction or interruption where we hear more lyricism and hope, and really the power of opera as well. So if you give me just a second, I will switch over to share my screen, and we'll do a little bit of the prologue from Ariadne auf Naxos.
Sie suche ich im ganzen Hause. Womit kann ich dienen? Muss allerdings bemerken, dass ich pressiert bin.
Okay, so that's just a little preview of the very beginning of Ariadne auf Naxos, and you can hear it just sort of tumbles right into the first scene. I wanted to play just a little bit of that opening too, because you hear a sung male voice and then a spoken male voice, because there is a spoken role, which I'll get to in the first act also. So after the prologue, or rather during the intermission between the two halves, we as an audience sort of change gears during the intermission. During the prologue in the first half, we are sort of getting a fly on the wall perspective of what is happening backstage during these party preparations. And then during the opera, or the second half, we as audience members sort of transform into the guests at the party of the richest man in Vienna. So think about that as you're stretching your legs during the intermission during one of the performances. A little more about the two creators of Ariadne auf Naxos, the composer Richard Strauss and the librettist Hugo von Hofmannsthal. The librettist is the person responsible for writing the words in the opera. These were really two Viennese giants at the turn of the 20th century. They're writing in 1900, 1910, 1920s. But they were sort of an unlikely pairing. Hofmannsthal, the librettist, really enjoyed the world of abstract ideas. I think maybe that's why he was attracted to this idea of writing an opera about the myth of Ariadne. Meanwhile, Strauss was sort of famous for his simplicity and his tastes. I find that very interesting, thinking of how complex the music is that he writes throughout his career. But these two gentlemen, it was not the first time that they had collaborated. Strauss and von Hofmannsthal had previously collaborated on Elektra in 1909. Now, if you are not familiar with Elektra, it is a rather dramatic and admittedly sort of horrifying one-act opera, also based on Greek mythology, about one very, very messed up family. It was very successful, though, in a sort of shocking way for the classical music community. And after that piece, they worked on Der Rosenkavalier, their second piece together. Rosenkavalier is a luscious, grand three-act opera, not about mythology at all, about very real people, that sort of is focusing on the passing of time and how we all react to that, no matter where we might be in our lives. After the success of those two rather intense pieces, to use the librettist's own word, von Hofmannsthal, they wanted to follow up with a lighter trifle, something lighter, before they moved on to something more important. These were the words that they used. That important piece that they would do after this would eventually be Die Frau ohne Schatten, another mythical piece, but that's a talk for another time. And so they ended up collaborating on Ariadne auf Naxos. But there's rather a bizarre sequence of events that led to the full opera that we know of today. It started with the librettist von Hofmannsthal. He was preparing for an adaptation of Molière's play Le Bourgeois Gentilhomme. And it was sort of typical at the time that sometimes plays would be followed by musical entertainment, sometimes operas. So he approached Strauss to see if they would write a divertissement, or a little like one-act opera, to be performed after the play. They decided they want sort of a pastiche of high and low society that would sort of reflect on the themes of the Molière play. That's why they sort of decided on this mashup of a mythical opera happening at the same time as a comedic piece. And they came up with the concept for the second half, the opera portion of Ariadne auf Naxos. They weren't rather pleased with the result. However, the opera plus the play then ended up spanning to be over 6 hours long. So 1 year after the premiere, Hofmannsthal and Strauss decided to replace that spoken play with a prologue that would set up the double opera second half. So interestingly, it was actually written with the second half first, and then the first half. Most of this is because they did have eyes on a commercial future for this piece that they wrote. You know, it's difficult enough to produce operas and plays, but in order to do this entire piece as was originally intended, you would have to have an entire opera company, an entire theater company, and they would need to collaborate on a 6-hour evening. That's not what they wanted. So what they came up with instead is this 90-minute second half opera, and then a brief little chestnut of a prologue. The prologue zips by very quickly. It's only about 45 minutes in length. There's lots of laughs, there's lots of stage action. And then that is followed by the second half that begins quite serious, then has some comedic turns, and then it's capped off with this absolutely transcendent final love duet for the soprano and tenor, as many great operas do. It's sort of a nod to the really like 19th century tradition of ending with a big duet for the soprano and for the tenor. So I want to tell you a little more about the musical style of Ariadne auf Naxos now. If you're familiar with Strauss, again, or some of the titles that I previously mentioned, a lot of his works were these gargantuan symphonic pieces, Salome, Electra, Der Rosenkavalier. These pieces have massive orchestras, like sometimes so big that you can't even fit them into the pit. But for Ariadne auf Naxos, Strauss decided to really telescope down his compositional powers into just a 37-piece orchestra. Now that's roughly a Mozart-sized orchestra, depending on the house that's producing it. But for Strauss, this is really a chamber opera. It's really the perfect fit to tell this story because it allows in the prologue to have this rather conversational quality where the action can move very fast, sprightly, and lively. But there's enough in that instrumentation for these lyric and dramatic moments in the second half. So I'm going to tell you a few things to listen for when you're seeing a performance, just a little roadmap to sort of help guide you through it. The first that I want to introduce you to is the composer and the composer's aria. This is a character in the opera named the composer. Doesn't have a real name, but it's the composer of the dramatic piece of the opera. This character is obsessed with music and with composition and waxing poetically about the role of music in society. This character is a little neurotic at times because they're constantly worried about details and perfection, just a composer sort of firing on all cylinders. Now you can imagine when the composer learns that their dramatic piece is going to be played at the same time as the comedic piece, their world is turned upside down because they fear that their piece that they've worked so hard on is going to be butchered with this comedy. And so the composer has an aria right at the end of the prologue that just, I want to plant the seed for you to remember about. This is just an absolutely ravishing piece of music that is sort of a mashup of its own. There's it's like a parody of and an homage to these lofty ideas of a dedicated artist. This is a pants role, so it's written for a mezzo, but performed as a male role, just like Cherubino in Le Nozze di Figaro, let's say. And the composer is only in the first act. You can kind of feel that they think, okay, they're setting up the entire opera, and then they learn that it's going to be butchered, and they kind of say, that's it, I can't even be around to watch it happen. So keep an eye out for the composer's aria towards the end of the prologue. The next piece that I want to tune your ear to listen for is in the opening of the second half. So before we just heard the opening of the prologue, now the opening of the opera itself. Before we get to see Ariadne herself, we are introduced to 3 nymphs. These are 3, again, from the Greek mythology. They're meeting Ariadne on the island of Naxos. This selection is very atmospheric, it's very florid, there's very complex harmonies as they sort of serenade and console Ariadne. I want to play a little bit of this as it's the complete opposite of this rather frenetic and fast-paced prologue. So here's just a little bit of the entrance of the nymphs. At the top, of the second half, the opera portion of Ariadne auf Naxos. I just adore that music. And I just want to point out that the concept of a trio of female voices is certainly not something that Strauss introduced by this. He started as stepping back into a tradition of this. If we think of the Magic Flute, which has been seen at Lakes Area Music Festival before, think of the Three Ladies, or Rusalka by Dvorak, the Three Wood Nymphs, or Wagner's The Ring Cycle, the Rhine Maidens are in trios. So we see him sort of referencing almost opera stereotypes by having the nymphs be a trio of women. But boy, it's great vocal writing. I adore it. After that, you heard one different voice come in after those three ladies with an ach, kind of a wailing, bemoaning ach. That is the entrance of Ariadne. So soon after the entrance of the three nymphs, the next piece I want to draw your attention to is Ariadne's aria Es gibt ein Reich. This is one of Strauss's most magnificent solos for the dramatic soprano voice. We find her on the island of Naxos, abandoned by her former lover Theseus, and it's this just soaring, lyric, dramatic aria about her longing for death. I'm not going to play any of that one for you because we're about to hear Felicia Moore sing it in just a few weeks, but keep that in your mind of Ariadne's aria towards the beginning of the second act. And then the last piece I want to introduce you to, I could talk all day about all of the music in this, but just a couple things to hold on to, is the aria of Zerbinetta. So Zerbinetta is the sort of counterpart to Ariadne. Ariadne is the soprano who is the lead of the mythical serious opera, and then Zerbinetta is the the comedic foil. She comes from the Commedia dell'arte tradition, which is an Italian tradition of traveling comedic performers that would step into rather stock characters. And they're sort of like clowns in a way. They're there to entertain. So Zerbinetta's aria is called Großmächtige Prinzessin. This is a massive sort of 11 or 12-minute grand scene for the comedic soprano. And in this moment, this is where the operas sort of mash up together. She stumbles upon Ariadne. Zerbinetta is walking around with her sort of comedy troupe, and then they come across this depressed and sulking woman, literally wailing and moaning on a rock. And so Zerbinetta decides to try and cheer her up with some singing and then some dancing with her counterparts. Zerbinetta's aria is an extended aria of fiendishly difficult coloratura, dizzying high notes. It's incredibly gratifying for the audience, but it is, for as much fun as it is to listen to, it is that challenging for the soprano that has to sing it. So I'm going to play a little bit of this from the middle of it. There's like 3 big sections of this aria, and I could spend all 12 minutes playing this for you, but instead I'll just play a little bit from the middle of it to get a sense of the vocal writing for Zerbinetta. So let's get this going. I'll show you a picture then of sort of the traditional costuming for the role for this type of character in the Commedia dell'arte troupe. Okay, and we'll start here. I mean, I find that to be an incredibly challenging passage, and then it tumbles on for another 4 minutes. So keep an eye out for Zerbinetta's big showcase piece about halfway through the second half. There's a massive cast of characters, so I won't be able to introduce you to all of them before I start speaking with Felicia, our title character. But you can think of all of the roles sort of divided into 3 groups. There is the dramatic opera troupe, the comedic opera troupe, and then the servants of the house that are preparing for this party and the presentation. So within the opera, we have Ariadne, we have the tenor named Bacchus, the composer, and the trio of nymphs. Now, interestingly, since the role of Ariadne, when we're backstage in the prologue, she's actually referred to as the prima donna, and then she's referred to as Ariadne in the second half. Similarly, Bacchus, the big tenor role, is just known as the tenor in the first half. Then we have the Commedia dell'arte troupe, as I mentioned. That's Zerbinetta and her sort of clown-like friends, Harlequin, Truffaldino, Brigella, and Scaramuccio. And then we have the servants of the house, the richest man in Vienna. Most importantly, the major domo, which is the spoken role that I mentioned, a lackey, there's also a wig maker, there's a dancing master, a lot of fun roles in that first half. So just to put some faces to names before I bring Felicia onto the program, let me just introduce you to some of our cast members. Here we go. So I'll introduce you to these 6 roles. On the top left, we have soprano Felicia Moore, who'll be joining us for Ariadne. In the center, on the top, we have Abigail Levis, mezzo-soprano, who will be singing the role of the composer. She's been with Lake Seria before. On the top right, we have Brandy Sutton, soprano. She'll be singing the role of Zerbinetta. If you saw, when I first started as an artistic advisor, I curated a recital to sort of kick off my my position as an advisor. Is during COVID, so this was a digital recital. You may remember Brandy from that recital. On the bottom left, we have dramatic tenor Aaron Dwayne Brooks singing the role of Bacchus, making his LAMF debut. Then on the bottom, a very familiar face, Taylor Ward, who will be singing the music teacher in Ariadne. And then in the bottom right, Justin Austin, who was also on that program, the recital that I programmed with Brandy, singing the role of Harlequin, one of the clowns in Zerbinetta's troupe. He also has a wonderful aria in the second half. The opera will be conducted by LAMF's music director, Christian Reif, and directed by J.J. Hudson. So I hope that that provides you with a little bit of an introduction to the piece. And now it's my pleasure to welcome to the program soprano Felicia Moore to get to speak with our title role. As Felicia's coming on, I'll just brag about her briefly. Felicia made her Met debut just this last season, singing First Lady in the Magic Flute, and is really a fantastic dramatic voice. And I'm very pleased that she's joined me for this program and also for Ariadne. So Felicia, welcome to this morning's program.
Thank you so much.
So I'd like to just ask, could you tell everybody where you are right now and what you're preparing for? Because there's an interesting connection to LAMF.
Yeah, so right now I am in beautiful Portland, Maine, working on Der Fliegende Holländer with Opera Maine, which we were of course supposed to do in 2020 with Lake Seria Music Festival, but we all know what happened that year. So, but it's exciting to get to do it here. So I'm having a great time.
You know, the best laid plans just disappeared from all of us. So I'm glad that this year we get a 2-year delayed LAMF debut for you.
Yes, I'm so excited.
Yeah. I'm curious, have you ever been to Minnesota or to the Lakes area north of the Twin Cities?
I've been to Minnesota once. I did probably the coolest and weirdest gig of my life there, where I was a part of something called Diva Cage Match, where we did like a faux competition in a wrestling ring in full gowns and heels. And it was a great time. There was like a local rapper who was a judge and Lucas Meacham.
Wow.
And it was awesome.
This is the first I'm hearing about it, but I'm definitely going to be looking that up once we finish this program.
Yeah.
Well, I know you will enjoy the Brainerd Lakes area. It's just a beautiful neck of the woods, so to speak, a neck of the lakes. And they have a beautiful new performing arts venue that just opened too. So I think we're very fortunate to be there. So tell us a little bit about your musical journey. What drew you to a career as an opera singer, and sort of where did your journey begin?
I came to opera kind of late. I did my undergraduate at Westminster Choir College, and I really thought that I was going to be a choral singer. Like that was what I was really passionate about. But as I got older and my voice grew, it was pretty clear that that was not going to work because I was constantly sticking out of the texture in every choral ensemble. So I sort of found opera more as a necessity of like, how am I going to sing and use my real voice and not feel like I have to shut down all the time.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, so I didn't really discover or really fall in love with opera, to be honest, until my master's. And then I started to really fall in love with acting as well, because that was also very terrifying to me as a child. Like, oh God. And I say that as an undergrad. I was a child. And I was like, oh, I have to act too. This is awful. Um, but in my master's, I was like, oh, I want to be more fearless. I really like this.
Hmm. Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, it's such a different way of performing within a choral tradition versus a solo operatic tradition. And you sort of touched on something I want to talk about. You are often referred to as a dramatic soprano, and
Mhm.
in that we're talking about your Fach. And for
Mhm.
those in the audience, a Fach is a German word for how we classify types of singers. So within soprano, you can have a lyric, a coloratura, a dramatic. Um, how do you feel about that term? And in especially knowing a little bit more about your development, what are
Mhm.
your thoughts on the word dramatic soprano?
I have like mixed feelings about it, to be honest. It's
Mhm,
very helpful in terms of like, what am I supposed to be singing? What am I supposed to be doing? And sometimes labels like that are very helpful.
mhm,
Um, but it's not necessarily helpful to think about while I'm singing or anything like that. I sing the way I sing, and if it happens to fit that rep, then that's great. But it's also really good because I wasn't singing that stuff for quite a while, and then when I did start to settle into my voice, and as I got older, that felt like home, and that's really it's so comforting to find your musical and vocal home in that kind of way.
right. Yeah. Now, even with that term of a dramatic soprano or a significant sized instrument,
Mhm.
your most recent season has included Mozart and Beethoven and Mahler and Wagner right now, and then Strauss. How do you approach preparing for different styles of composition with your instrument?
Yeah. Um, I wouldn't say that my approach, like before I get to the job, is that different because my voice is what it is and I prep it the way I prep it. But then when I'm in the room, the collaboration with different styles is very different. Like within Mozart, within singing with a trio of ladies, that is very different than like Wagner, where it's like you're just riding the wave of that orchestra pretty much by yourself. Like,
Mhm,
um, and then with Strauss, the way that the vocal line really co-mingles with every line in the orchestra is very different. It's a very different collaboration within each style. So I don't know that like my own preparation is that different beyond being aware of that.
mhm,
Um, but it really feels different once you're actually finally with everybody.
mhm, mhm. So for a role like Ariadne, which is, one of the signature roles for the dramatic soprano, how long have you been working on a role like this? Has it been in your mind for a while? Have you had opportunities to perform it? What has your journey been like with this specific role?
Yeah, I started learning it in my master's, so it's been like 10 years of me learning this role.
Mhm,
Um, I started just with the beginning scene with her monologue and the aria.
mhm,
And then right when the pandemic hit, I was actually supposed to be doing it in Arizona. So I fully have had this role prepped for quite a while. Um, yeah, it's been a long journey with her, actually.
yeah. Well, I'm thrilled that, I'm sorry to hear that the previous one didn't happen, but what a treat for the Brainerd audiences to get to hear it for the first time then. Is this your first title role?
No, I've done Katya Kabanova,
Ah, mhm,
um, Sor Angelica.
mhm.
that might be it.
You're adding to your title role.
Yes. Yes.
So as I mentioned in the presentation, the role is actually technically split. In the first half, the role is referred to as the prima donna. I will spoil it for our audiences. You barely get to sing in the first half. It sort of is just like a warm-up for the big lifting in the second half. But you get a lot of character because she sort of is this like behind the scenes. You get the singer behind the scenes, and then you get the singer as, you know, soprano in character.
Mm-hmm.
Which do you relate to more, the prima donna or the Ariadne? You can say neither too.
Well, I'd probably be lying if I said I didn't relate to the prima donna at all. I think anybody could probably relate to her a little bit. I don't really relate to Ariadne too much, sadly. But I mean, if I had to pick somebody from the show, I would probably say composer. And I think most musicians, I mean, because he's anxious and just excited. He's so passionate and is very controlling. But all because he just loves it so much, and I would be shocked if any musician would not relate to that.
Yeah, you know, like one of the words in the libretto is one of the phrases is die heilige Kunst. It's just talking about the highest art form of opera being this sort of summary and pinnacle of all the art forms coming together. So good answer. I should have said which character do you relate to. So the two like main relationships for Ariadne in the second half are between Zerbinetta, the sort of the foil of the comedic opera, and then Bacchus, the tenor. I'm curious about Zerbinetta in particular. What do you think Ariadne really thinks about her, either as like Ariadne the character or the prima donna playing Zerbinetta? Is she pissed off? Is there an emotional connection? Is there, because they have some really like sentimental bonding moments in that scene, right? How do
Yeah.
you feel about all that?
I mean, I don't know what our production will do, but my like preliminary thoughts before we work on it is, I mean, I really think that there's a part of her that is a bit jealous of her and how free she can be. And I mean, she would never admit this. Ariadne is so stubborn. She would never ever admit this. But I think, like, obviously, while Zerbinetta is singing her massive monologue, she is really listening, and with Harlequin too. She doesn't want them to know that she's listening, but she is really taking in that information. So while I think she probably is a bit jealous, I also think she thinks that's ridiculous, and to not have that commitment and to one person, and to not let yourself be transformed by that commitment to one person is just like not the way that anybody should live. So it's very complicated relationship between the two of them because they are so different sides of one coin of how you live.
And Zerbinetta just have those few moments where she kind of expresses sadness too.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then transformation is such an interesting word to bring up because I feel like then everybody leaves and on comes the tenor.
Yeah. Yeah.
The second half of the second act is just this like massive duet between the soprano and the tenor. It's like, it's thrilling, but it does have this sense of like transformation.
Yeah.
I don't does any of that resonate with you either musically or dramatically in the scene with Bacchus that closes the opera?
Yeah, because when we first meet Ariadne, she is a princess of Crete who has been abandoned. And when we leave her at the end of the show, she is a goddess. And that has happened through him and through their love of one another and sort of blind faith within each other, to be honest. But that's what the whole show really ends on.
Yeah. Well, before we wrap up this program, I have one more question for you, and then I see we have at least one other question in the chat. But if our audience has any other questions, feel free to drop them in right now. But my first question for you, Felicia, is what voices have inspired you in your vocal training and in your vocal development, either sopranos or otherwise? Who's on your list that maybe our Lakes area audiences should give a listen to?
Yeah, some favorites for sure are Eileen Farrell. I obsessed, obsessed. Eleanor Steber, vocally perfect, just vocally perfect. Leontine Price, vocally perfect. Callas, of course. Um, I'm only listening Sopranos, but
Fair enough.
I can't help it. Probably when I'm not listening to opera, which is rare,
Mhm.
um, I've got Ella Fitzgerald on. I think she's a musical genius, and it's really fun to listen to jazzier stuff, and especially with Eileen Farrell, and the way
Mhm.
that that kind of phrasing can influence classical singing is really cool.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Ella is just the ultimate palate cleanser, right?
absolutely.
So I think we have just one question from the audience before we wrap up, and it's for Felicia. Can you talk about what it is like practicing your role without the whole cast there? I imagine it's strange to do so much of the work on your own for a production like an opera. So maybe I'll add to that, like, is the preparation different for maybe solo recital or symphonic work versus operatic work? What's the process like when you're not in the room with the other singers?
Yeah, that is hard, especially in the prologue, I will say.
Because as you see, the prologue is very fast.
Very fast. A lot of people are saying a lot of stuff.
Yep, a lot of German.
Yeah, a lot of German going on. Um, yeah, it's just harder because you have to know what everybody is saying and just what everything that's going on, and especially like something like the prologue. It reminds me a lot of like Falstaff or Skiki, where like something will probably go wrong and you have to know what it is and how to fix it. Not in the performances, but in rehearsals. It just takes a long time to get that kind of fast speech on its feet. Um, yeah, that's pretty much all that the difference is just that you have to know the full picture.
Right. And it's so different from the score that you're working on right now with The Flying Dutchman, with Zenta, where it's not really conversational at all.
No,
You're
it
never
is.
singing with other people. It's all rather, it's sort of a different end of the spectrum.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Well, Felicia, thank you so much for joining us this morning. And to
Sure.
everybody watching on Zoom and on Facebook, thank you for joining us to learn about Ariadne auf Naxos. Again, the performances are on August 12th and 14th, so they will be here before we know it. But yeah, thank you, Felicia. Thank you to everybody. And we look forward to seeing all of you at one of the performances in just a few weeks.
Thank you so much.
All right. Take care, everyone.
Bye.